Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave. Bull Thornton wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as the Montana sun beat down mercilessly on his sprawling ranch. The drought had been brutal this summer of 1952, turning his once green pastures into cracked earth and dust. He was inspecting his dying cattle when he heard the small voice behind him, a boy, maybe 10 years old, dirty and thin, holding coiled rope in his tiny hands. "Buy my rope, sir. Mama ain't eaten in days." Bull froze, not because of the boy's ragged appearance or desperate plea, but because of something impossible, the way the child braided that rope in a pattern Bull had taught only one person in his entire life, his daughter Mary, who'd vanished in a blizzard 20 years ago when she was exactly this boy's age. The boy's eyes held an ancient sadness that didn't belong in such a young face. When he smiled, Bull's heart nearly stopped. It was Mary's smile, crooked on the left side, just like her mother's had been. Who was this mysterious child, and why did everything about him echo the daughter Bull had lost to the unforgiving Montana wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Bull's hand instinctively moved to the worn leather holster at his hip, though he couldn't say why. The boy stood there patient as stone, those two old eyes studying Bull's face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The rope coiled in the child's small hands caught the harsh afternoon light, and Bull could see every twist of the braid, 3 strands over 2, then under, creating that distinctive diamond pattern he'd shown Mary during those long winter evenings by the fire. "Where'd you learn to braid like that, son?" Bull's voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by dust and something deeper. The boy tilted his head, and there it was again, Mary's gesture, the way she used to consider his questions with such serious deliberation. "Mama taught me. She said it was important to remember the old ways." Bull's throat constricted. 20 years of carefully constructed walls threatened to crumble at the sound of that phrase. Remember the old ways. Mary had said those exact words the last time he'd seen her alive, clutching her own rope as she headed out to check the fence line, despite the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He'd been too busy arguing with his foreman about winter feed to pay proper attention to his 10-year-old daughter's warning about the weather, the biggest mistake of his life. "What's your name, boy?" "Jamie." The child shifted the rope to one hand and wiped his nose with the back of the other. "Jamie Collins. My mama's sick and we ain't got much food left. This rope's real good, won't fray or snap even in a storm." Bull stared at the boy's face, searching for some rational explanation. The resemblance was uncanny, but resemblances happened. Coincidences were more common than miracles, especially in a hard land that seemed to breed similar types of people. Lean, weathered, shaped by the same unforgiving elements. Still, something cold settled in his gut as he watched Jamie demonstrate the rope's strength, pulling it taut between his small hands with practiced ease. Mary had done the same thing, always proud of her handiwork, always eager to prove she could make something lasting in a world that seemed determined to tear everything apart. "How much you want for it?" Bull heard himself asking, though he had a barn full of rope already. "Whatever you think's fair, sir. Just, Mama really is hungry." The desperation in the boy's voice cut through Bull's hesitation. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, more than the rope was worth by any reasonable measure, but less than what those haunting similarities were doing to his peace of mind. Jamie's eyes widened at the sight of the money. That's real generous, mister. Mama's gonna be so relieved." "Where you folks staying?" Bull asked, accepting the rope with hands that trembled slightly. The braided leather felt warm from the boy's touch, and for just a moment Bull could swear he smelled his late wife's lavender soap, the same soap Mary had always used. "About 3 miles north, past the old Miller Creek bed. There's a little cabin back in the cottonwoods." Jamie stuffed the $5 bill carefully into his torn shirt pocket. "Mama wanted to come herself, but she's been feeling poorly." Bull knew every inch of his land and the surrounding territory. The old Miller place had been abandoned since the bank took it back in '34. Nobody had lived there for going on 20 years. The cabin wasn't even standing anymore. He'd seen the collapsed roof timbers himself just last spring when he'd ridden through checking for strays. "This mama of yours got a name?" Something flickered across Jamie's face, too quick to interpret. "She just likes to be called Mama. Says her given name belongs to a different life." The boy took a step backward toward the gate. "I better get this money to her before dark. She worries when I'm gone too long." "Hold on." Bull moved forward, but Jamie was already backing away faster. "Why don't you let me drive you home? It's a long walk and the heat's fierce today." "No, sir, that's real kind, but I know these paths better than roads." "Thank you for the money, mister. God bless." Before Bull could protest further, the boy turned and ran, not the awkward gait of a child, but with the sure-footed grace of someone who'd grown up navigating rough country. Bull watched until the small figure disappeared behind a rise dotted with dying sagebrush. He looked down at the rope in his hands. The diamond pattern seemed to pulse in the fading light, each twist exactly as he'd taught Mary all those years ago. His fingers traced the familiar weave, while his mind wrestled with possibilities that defied every rational thought he'd ever entertained. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that raised the hair on Bull's neck and reminded him of another evening, long ago, when the world had changed forever. He coiled the rope carefully and headed toward the house, but his eyes kept drifting north, toward the abandoned Miller place and whatever secrets the gathering darkness might be hiding. Bull stood on his porch for a long moment, the boy's rope coiled tight in his weathered hands, watching the empty horizon where Jamie Collins had vanished. The August heat still pressed down despite the approaching dusk, but something colder had settled deep in his chest, a familiar ache he'd spent 20 years learning to ignore. The screen door's sharp bang announced Rosa Martinez before her voice did. "Senor Bull, your dinner's getting cold." His housekeeper emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, then stopped short when she saw his face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Bull almost laughed at that, but the sound caught in his throat. "Just a boy selling rope." He held up the braided leather. "Reminded me of something is all." Rosa's dark eyes softened with understanding she'd earned through 15 years of watching him wrestle with grief. She'd been Mary's favorite among the ranch-hand's wives, the one who'd taught his daughter to make tortillas and braid flowers into her hair for church. "Come eat. Whatever's troubling you will keep until morning." The kitchen smelled of Rosa's cooking, beef stew and fresh bread that should have made his mouth water. Instead, Bull found himself picking at his food while his mind circled back to that too familiar braiding pattern. Rosa bustled around the kitchen, cleaning up from the day's work, chattering about the drought and her youngest grandson's birthday, but he barely heard her. "The Brennan place lost another dozen head to the heat," she was saying. "Found them down by the dried-up creek bed. Makes a man wonder how much longer any of us can hold on out here." Bull nodded absently. The drought had been killing cattle for 3 months now, forcing ranchers throughout the county to sell off stock early or watch them die. He'd been luckier than most. His wells ran deeper than his neighbors, and he had enough saved to buy feed when the pastures failed. But luck was a finite resource in this country, and everyone's was running thin. "You should think about selling some of the north section," Rosa continued, refilling his coffee cup. "Tom Bradley's been asking about it again. Says he'd pay good money." "That land's not for sale." Bull's response came sharper than intended, and Rosa raised an eyebrow. The north section included the old Miller place, though he'd never explained to anyone why he rode out there alone every spring and fall. Some grief was too personal to share, even with someone as trusted as Rosa. After dinner, Bull retreated to his study, the one room in the house that remained exactly as it had been during his marriage. Sarah's books still lined the shelves, her reading chair positioned by the window where she'd catch the last light of day. Mary's drawings covered one wall, childish sketches of horses and cowboys that Sarah had insisted on framing like masterpieces. Bull poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and settled behind his desk, where account books and cattle records waited for his attention. The rocking tea ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of Montana badlands, supporting nearly 2,000 head of cattle and employing 12 full-time hands. It was an empire built through 30 years of grinding work, smart decisions, and stubborn refusal to quit when lesser men walked away. It was also his prison. Every fence line, every grazing pasture, every barn and bunkhouse represented another chain binding him to this place where loss lived in every shadow. He could sell it all tomorrow. Tom Bradley and a dozen other buyers would jump at the chance. He could buy a small place in town, maybe travel like Sarah had always wanted to do. See the ocean she'd dreamed about before consumption took her 10 years ago. But leaving would mean abandoning the last place Mary had been alive. It would mean accepting she was truly gone. Bull opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by countless handlings. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, lay Mary's last attempt at rope braiding, a short length of leather she'd been working on the morning she died. The pattern was irregular, the work of a child still learning, but the diamond weave was unmistakably there. He set Jamie's rope beside Mary's unfinished piece. The similarities made his hands shake. Same pattern, same tension, same precise attention to detail that had always marked Mary's best work. But that was impossible. Mary had been dead for 20 years, buried in the family plot behind the house under a marker that read, "Mary Elizabeth Thornton, beloved daughter, lost to the storm." Bull drained his whiskey and tried to focus on the ledgers, but the numbers blurred together. Outside, night sounds began, cattle lowing in the distance, the wind rattling loose shutters, coyotes calling to each other across the vast emptiness. Familiar sounds that usually brought comfort after another day survived in hard country. Tonight, they only reminded him how alone he was, and how thin the line between memory and madness could become for a man who'd spent too many years talking to ghosts. Bull jerked awake to the sound of something striking his study window, a soft but insistent tapping that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a telegraph key. The whiskey glass lay overturned on his desk, amber liquid staining the cattle records he'd never finished reviewing. His neck ached from sleeping slumped in the chair, and for a moment he couldn't place what had startled him from dreams of Mary's voice calling through a blizzard. The tapping came again. Bull pushed himself upright, joints protesting after 30 years of ranch work and a night spent contorted in a leather chair. The clock on his desk read 4:30. Outside, the world existed in that peculiar half-light before sunrise, when familiar shapes turned strange and distance became impossible to judge. He moved to the window, peering through glass that reflected his own weathered face back at him like a ghost. Nothing moved in the yard, no wind to rattle branches against the house. Even the cattle were still, dark shapes scattered across the pasture like boulders. But something had woken him, something deliberate and urgent that made the hair on his arms stand up. Then he saw it. A small figure stood just beyond the circle of light from his porch lamp, motionless as a fence post but unmistakably human. Bull's blood went cold as ice water. The figure raised one arm in a slow wave, then turned and began walking north toward the old Miller place, moving with that same sure-footed grace he'd witnessed yesterday evening. Jamie Collins. But no child should be wandering alone across the Badlands before dawn, especially not one claiming his mother was sick and needed help. Bull grabbed his hat and boots, pulling on clothes with hands that trembled from more than just interrupted sleep. He strapped on his gun belt out of habit and instinct. This country had taught him never to venture out unarmed, day or night. The familiar weight of the Colt against his hip provided a comfort his rational mind couldn't supply. The front door's hinges protested as he stepped onto the porch. The air carried that peculiar coolness that preceded sunrise in the desert, but underneath it lay something else. a scent like old roses and dust that reminded him of the perfume Sarah used to wear to church. Impossible, since she'd been dead 10 years and had never favored roses anyway. "Jamie?" His voice carried farther than expected in the still air. "Boy, what are you doing out here?" No answer came back, but he could see the small figure continuing north, following a path that would lead through the broken fence line onto what used to be Miller property. Bull descended the porch steps and set off in pursuit, boots crunching on drought-hardened earth that hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. The walking should have been easy. Bull knew every rock and gully on this land, but somehow the familiar terrain felt foreign under his feet. Distances stretched wrong, as if the darkness was playing tricks with perspective. He'd walked this route hundreds of times, but tonight it seemed to take forever to reach the fallen fence posts that marked his property line. By the time he crossed onto the old Miller place, the boy had vanished again. Bull stood among the cottonwoods where Miller Creek used to run year-round, before the drought and overgrazing turned it into a seasonal trickle. The trees rose around him like cathedral pillars, their leaves whispering secrets in a language he'd forgotten how to understand. Somewhere ahead lay the ruins of the Miller cabin, nothing now but collapsed roof timbers and a stone foundation slowly being reclaimed by prairie grass. Except there was light ahead, warm and yellow, like lamplight flowing through windows. Bull's hand moved to his gun without conscious thought. He'd been on this land just 3 months ago, checking for strays after the spring storms. There had been no cabin then, no signs of habitation except pack rats and the occasional coyote den. Yet now he could clearly see the glow filtering through what appeared to be intact windows and smoke rising from a chimney that shouldn't exist. He moved closer, trying to reconcile what his eyes reported with what his memory insisted was true. The cabin stood whole and solid, whitewashed logs chinked tight against the weather, a garden plot beside the front door where tomatoes and beans climbed toward stakes that cast long shadows in the lamplight. A horse grazed in a makeshift corral, lifting its head to watch his approach with intelligent eyes. The front door opened before Bull could decide whether to call out or retreat. A woman emerged onto the porch, tall and slender, wearing a dress that might have been fashionable 20 years ago. Her face remained shadowed, but something about the way she moved, the graceful tilt of her head, sent recognition flooding through him like a lightning strike. "Hello, Bull," she said, and her voice carried notes he'd heard in dreams for 2 decades. "I've been waiting for you to come home." Behind her, just visible in the doorway, stood Jamie Collins, no longer the ragged boy selling rope, but dressed in clean clothes that belonged to a different era entirely. Bull faced a choice that would define whatever remained of his life: step forward into impossibility or turn and flee from answers he'd spent 20 years afraid to find. Bull's boots felt rooted to the hard-packed earth, as if the ground itself had turned to quicksand. Every instinct screamed at him to run, back to his truck, back to his house, back to the familiar prison of grief that had sustained him for 20 years. But his body betrayed him, muscles locked tight while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged animal. The woman on the porch waited with infinite patience, her face still lost in shadow. The lamplight behind her created a golden nimbus around her silhouette, and Bull's mind reeled with the impossibility of what he was seeing. Dead women didn't rebuild cabins. Dead daughters didn't appear as strange boys selling rope. Dead families didn't invite you home for coffee and explanations. "This ain't real," he whispered, the words falling into the still air like stones into a deep well. "This can't be real." But the horse in the corral snorted and stamped its feet. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking, cornbread maybe or biscuits, drifted across the clearing. Real details, solid and present, that made his certainty crumble like drought-parched earth. What if he was wrong? What if stepping forward meant discovering some rational explanation that would shatter what remained of his sanity? Drifters sometimes squatted in abandoned places. The boy could be anyone, some homeless kid whose mother had found temporary shelter in a cabin that had somehow survived when Bull thought it hadn't. Coincidences happened. Children resembled other children. grief could make a man see patterns where none existed. But what if he was right? What if the impossible had somehow become possible, and Sarah and Mary were truly standing 20 yards away, waiting for him to find the courage to close the distance between the living and the dead? Bull's hand trembled as it moved toward his gun, then stopped. What was he planning to do? Shoot ghosts? Draw down on his own family, if that's what this was? The metal felt cold and foreign against his palm, a tool designed for a world that operated by rules he understood. This moment existed outside those rules, in territory where 30 years of hard-won wisdom meant nothing. "I can't," he said louder now, his voice cracking like an adolescent boy's. "I can't do this again." Because that was the truth he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. He couldn't survive losing them twice. The first time had nearly killed him, months of drinking himself unconscious every night, waking up with his gun in his hand and Sarah's perfume bottle emptied onto Mary's pillow just to catch some fading scent of the life he'd failed to protect. Rosa had found him that way more than once, talked him down from whatever final gesture he'd been contemplating with words and coffee and the simple insistence that tomorrow required him to still be breathing. He'd built his entire existence around managing that loss, carefully constructing routines and walls and safe distances that let him function without truly living. The rocking T wasn't just a ranch, it was a monument to control, to the illusion that a man could protect what mattered if he just worked hard enough and watched close enough and never again made the mistake of letting his guard down. The woman on the porch moved slightly, lamplight catching the curve of her cheek, and Bull's breath stopped completely. 20 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition so complete it felt like drowning. Sarah's profile, unmistakable even in shadow. The way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. The graceful turn of her wrist as she gestured toward him. "You don't have to be afraid," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered. Warm honey over gravel, with that slight catch on certain words that had always made him think of slow Sunday mornings and coffee shared in comfortable silence. But he was afraid, terrified in ways that stampeding cattle and blizzards and failing banks had never managed to make him. Because this offered something worse than death, it offered hope. And hope was the one luxury a man like Bull Thornton couldn't afford. Hope meant believing in possibilities beyond his control. Hope meant trusting that the universe might be something other than a grinding machine designed to crush everything beautiful and soft and worth protecting. Jamie stepped forward on the porch, into the circle of light, and Bull saw his daughter's eyes looking back at him from a stranger's face. Not just similar eyes, Mary's exact eyes, bright with intelligence and mischief and that peculiar mixture of wisdom and innocence that had always made her seem older than her years. "Papa," the boy said, and the word hit Bull like a physical blow. "We've been waiting so long for you to come home." The clearing spun around him. Bull stumbled backward, his heel catching on a fallen branch, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would either save him or destroy what remained of Samuel Bull Thornton entirely. Bull's knees buckled. He hit the ground hard, palms scraping against stones and dried grass, the impact jarring him back to his body. For a moment he knelt there, head down, breathing like a winded horse, while his mind fractured into 1,000 competing voices. Run, stay, fight, surrender. This is madness. This is miracle. This is everything you've feared. This is everything you've wanted. When he looked up, Sarah had descended the porch steps and stood just 10 feet away, close enough now that he could see her face clearly in the lamplight spilling from the cabin windows, the same face he'd memorized through 15 years of marriage, the same gentle eyes that had watched him stumble through early fatherhood, the same patient smile that had forgiven him every harsh word spoken in exhaustion and fear. "Hello, my love," she said, and her voice carried all the warmth and forgiveness he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. "You look tired." Bull's throat closed completely. He wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions hammering against his skull, but all that emerged was a broken sound somewhere between laugh and sob. 20 years of careful control, 20 years of numbness maintained through sheer willpower, cracked apart like ice under spring sun. Sarah moved closer, her bare feet making no sound on the earth. She wore the blue dress he'd bought her for their last anniversary, the one she'd been saving for a special occasion that never came before the consumption took her. The fabric looked fresh and new, as if she'd just finished pressing it for Sunday service. "I don't understand," Bull finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're dead. You're both dead. I buried you myself." "Death isn't what you think it is," Sarah said simply. She knelt beside him, close enough that he could smell her soap and the faint scent of lavender she'd always carried. "Neither is life, for that matter. You've been existing in between for so long, Bull, neither truly living nor properly dead. Just waiting." Jamie, or Mary, or whoever this child truly was, approached from the other side, moving with that same ethereal grace that had marked every encounter. Up close, the resemblance to his daughter was even more pronounced. The same stubborn cowlick that refused to stay flat, the same dusting of freckles across sun-darkened cheeks, the same way of tilting her head when studying something that puzzled her. "We tried calling to you before," the child said, voice carrying Mary's precise diction and careful word choices. "But you wouldn't listen. You built such tall walls around your heart, Papa. We could only reach you through dreams, and you always woke up before we could finish talking." Bull's hand moved without permission, reaching towards Sarah's face, then stopping inches short. "If I touch you, you'll disappear, like you always do." "Not this time." Sarah caught his trembling fingers in her own, and her skin felt real and warm and alive in ways that made him question everything he thought he knew about the nature of existence. "This time, you have a choice to make. You can keep living in the past, holding on to grief like it's the only proof we ever mattered, or you can come with us and learn what comes next." Come with you where? But even as he asked, Bull understood. This wasn't about visiting or temporary reunion. This was about crossing a threshold he'd spent 20 years approaching but never quite had the courage to pass through. The child, Mary, reached into a pocket and pulled out another length of braided rope. This one, showing the perfect diamond pattern he'd spent months teaching her before the blizzard stole her away. "Remember what you told me about knots, Papa? How the right ones get stronger under pressure, but the wrong ones just fall apart when you need them most?" He remembered. Late evenings in the barn, her small hands struggling with leather strips while he demonstrated again and again, patient in ways he'd rarely managed with ranch hands or business partners, teaching her that some things couldn't be rushed, that true craftsmanship required accepting failure as part of learning. "You've been tied to the wrong things," Sarah said gently. "Guilt and regret make poor anchors, my love. They'll drag you down eventually, no matter how strong you think you are." Bull looked back toward his ranch, though the buildings had vanished into darkness and distance. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, everything that defined Samuel Bull Thornton existed in that direction. His empire, his reputation, his carefully constructed identity as a man who'd survived what life threw at him. But when he turned back to Sarah and Mary, waiting with infinite patience beside a cabin that shouldn't exist, he realized that survival wasn't the same as living, and he was tired, bone deep, exhausted, from carrying the weight of unfinished grief. "If I come with you," he said slowly, "there's no going back." "No," Sarah agreed. "There never is. Once you finally choose to stop running from the truth." Bull took her hand and let them help him to his feet. The moment Bull's boots found solid ground again, the world around him shifted like a kaleidoscope, settling into a new pattern. The cabin's warm glow flickered and steadied, but the landscape beyond had changed. Where drought-scorched badlands should have stretched to the horizon, he now saw rolling hills dotted with healthy cattle, grass green enough to make a rancher weep with joy, and a creek that ran clear and strong between its banks. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice steadier now but filled with wonder that felt dangerous after decades of carefully managed expectations. "A threshold," Sarah replied, still holding his hand as they walked toward the cabin. Every choice creates one, Bull. Most people pass through without noticing, but some decisions require more deliberate crossing. Mary skipped ahead, her movements light and joyful in ways that made Bull's chest ache with recognition. But as they approached the porch, 3 figures emerged from the cabin's shadows, and Bull's newly found equilibrium shattered like glass. The first was a man Bull had hoped never to see again, James Morrison, the neighboring rancher whose cattle had been rustled the winter Mary died. Morrison looked exactly as he had 20 years ago, but his eyes held knowledge that belonged to someone who'd had 2 decades to piece together truths that the living had buried. "Morrison," Bull said, his free hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, I reckon," Morrison replied, his voice carrying none of the anger Bull remembered from their last encounter, learning the rules of a different kind of territory. Behind Morrison stood Rosa Martinez, but not the Rosa who still cooked at Bull's ranch. This Rosa appeared younger, wearing a dress that belonged to the 1930s, her dark hair pinned in victory rolls. Her eyes held the same warmth Bull knew, but also a sadness that spoke of knowledge gained through loss. "Rosa? But you're not—" Bull's words trailed off as understanding dawned. "You're not the Rosa I know. I'm the Rosa who died in childbirth in 1934, she said gently. "The one whose husband brought their surviving daughter north, looking for work on a ranch where she might grow up safe. The daughter you know as your Rosa, my Maria Elena." The third figure stepped forward, and Bull's world tilted completely off its axis. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, with Rosa's dark eyes and her own distinctive stubborn chin. But it was her voice that stopped his heart entirely. "Hello, Papa," she said, and Bull realized he was looking at Mary, not the 10-year-old he'd lost in the blizzard, but Mary as she would have been at 7, before illness and hunger had marked her features with premature wisdom. "I don't understand," Bull whispered, looking between the 2 versions of his daughter. "Which one?" "Time isn't what you think it is here," Sarah explained. "We exist as we need to be for each moment, each lesson. Mary at 10 carries the weight of what happened. Mary at 7 remembers the joy of learning rope work with her papa before everything got complicated." Morrison stepped closer, and Bull tensed, muscle memory preparing for conflict that had simmered for 20 years. But Morrison's expression held no animosity, only the patient regard of someone who'd learned to see past old grievances. "You think I'm here to settle scores about them missing cattle," Morrison said. "But I ain't. I'm here because some truths can't rest easy until they're spoken proper. And because crossing this threshold requires facing everyone you've wronged, just like it requires forgiving everyone who wronged you." "I never wronged you," Bull said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your cattle wandered off in a blizzard. Happens all the time in country like this." "My cattle didn't wander," Morrison replied quietly. "They were driven off, sold by medicine for Mary when the consumption got bad, medicine that never came because the man you paid took your money and disappeared into Colorado mining country." Bull's knees nearly buckled again. No, I bought that medicine. Dr. Patterson said—" "Dr. Patterson lied, Rosa," the young Rosa said gently. "He took money from desperate families all across the territory, promised cures that didn't exist, treatments that were nothing but sugar water and false hope. When Mary died, you needed someone to blame besides yourself. The missing cattle gave you that excuse." The 7-year-old Mary tugged at Bull's coat. "Papa, you carrying guilt for something that wasn't your fault, and shame for something that was love dressed up like stealing. But this place can't hold those kinds of mixed-up feelings. You got to sort them out before you can stay." Bull looked around the group. His wife, his daughter at 2 different ages, a neighbor he'd hated, and a woman who'd died before he'd ever met her, but whose legacy had kept him fed and cared for through 20 years of self-imposed isolation. "What do I have to do?" he asked. Morrison smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Truth, Bull. Just the truth, spoken plain and simple, about that winter, about Mary's death, and about why you really came to hate me so much." Bull felt the weight of 20 years pressing against his shoulders, but for the first time since that terrible blizzard, the burden felt like something he might finally be strong enough to carry. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Bull felt the weight of 5 pairs of eyes upon him, some patient, some knowing, all waiting for words he'd spent 20 years refusing to speak aloud. His throat worked soundlessly, decades of practiced stoicism warring against the sudden, desperate need to finally unburden himself. "The truth," he said slowly, testing the words like a man walking on ice. 20 years I've been telling myself lies, and they've become so familiar I almost believe them." Sarah squeezed his hand encouragingly, but her touch felt different now, less solid, as if his choice to speak or remain silent would determine whether she continued to exist or faded back into memory. "That winter," Bull's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat roughly. Mary had been coughing for months. Little thing at first, just a tickle that wouldn't go away, but it got worse and worse, until she couldn't sleep lying down anymore. Had to prop her up with every pillow in the house just so she could breathe. The 7-year-old Mary moved closer to him, her small hand finding his free one. Her touch was warm and real and achingly familiar. "Tell them about the medicine man, Papa." Bull closed his eyes, feeling the memory rise like bile in his throat. Dr. Patterson came through in late November, selling miracle cures out of the back of a painted wagon. Said he had medicine from back east that could cure consumption, but it was expensive, real expensive. "How expensive?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. $200. The number fell from Bull's lips like a stone into still water. Might as well have asked for the moon. We had maybe $30 to our name, and winter coming on hard. Rosa, the young Rosa, stepped forward, her dark eyes full of compassion. "So you did what any father would do." Bull's laugh came out bitter and broken. "I told myself that's what it was. Love, desperation. But the truth is, I was angry. Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at myself for being too poor to save my own daughter. And when a man gets that angry, he starts looking for ways to take what he needs instead of accepting what he can't have." The weight of confession pressed down on him, but for the first time in 20 years it felt like a burden shared rather than carried alone. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "You knew where my cattle wintered," Morrison said. "It wasn't a question. In that box canyon, 5 miles north of your main spread. Good shelter, easy water, and far enough from your house that you wouldn't check on them regular during a blizzard." Bull forced himself to meet Morrison's eyes. "I took 12 head, drove them south in the worst storm of the year, sold them to a buyer in Miles City who didn't ask too many questions about brands that might be hard to read in poor light." The 10-year-old Mary, the version who carried the weight of what came after, spoke quietly. But the medicine didn't work. There was no medicine. Bull's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Patterson took my money and disappeared before I got home. Mary died 3 days later, and I was holding stolen cash that couldn't save her, couldn't bring her back, couldn't do anything but prove what a fool I'd been." Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. "What happened to the money?" Bull felt his face burn with shame that had nothing to do with the theft. "I kept it. Told myself I'd earned it through grief, that it was compensation for what I'd lost. Used it to buy winter feed that kept our remaining stock alive until spring." He looked at Morrison with eyes that held 2 decades of self-loathing. "Your cattle died in that blizzard. All 12 head. I stole from you and got nothing for it but the knowledge that I was the kind of man who'd become a thief when tested." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Bull's face with the patience of someone who no longer felt the urgency of mortal time. When he finally spoke, his words carried forgiveness that Bull had never dared hope for. "I know," Morrison said simply. "Found the remains of my cattle that spring, tracked the signs back toward your spread before the trail went cold, spent years hating you for it, years planning what I'd do if I ever had proof." "Why didn't you?" Bull asked. because I watched you after Mary died. Watched you turn your grief inward like a blade, punishing yourself harder than any law or neighbor ever could. Seemed to me you were carrying enough weight already." Morrison paused, then added quietly, "Besides, I learned something about desperation myself when my Sarah got sick a few years later. Learned how far a man might go when the thing he loves most is slipping away." Bull felt something loosening in his chest, a knot of guilt and shame that had pulled tighter with each passing year. But with that loosening came a new terror. If he released this pain that had defined him for so long, what would be left of Samuel Bull Thornton? Morrison's forgiveness hung in the air like smoke, and Bull found himself struggling to breathe. For 20 years he'd carried his guilt like armor, letting it define every decision, every relationship, every moment of his carefully controlled existence. Without it, he felt exposed and vulnerable in ways that terrified him more than any physical threat ever could. "I don't know how to be a man who isn't carrying that weight," Bull admitted, his voice barely audible. "Take away the guilt, take away the shame, and what's left? What am I without the punishment I've been giving myself?" Sarah's face softened with understanding that cut deeper than any blade. "You're the man who taught his daughter to braid rope on winter evenings, the man who sang her to sleep when thunderstorms scared her, the man who loved so fiercely that losing us nearly destroyed him." But even as she spoke, Bull felt the ground beneath his feet beginning to shift. The peaceful landscape around the cabin started to waver like heat mirages, and the faces of those gathered began to blur at the edges. Panic seized his chest with iron claws. "You're disappearing," he gasped, reaching desperately toward Sarah's face. "I can see through you." The 10-year-old Mary stepped forward, her expression grave beyond her years. "This place only stays solid for folks ready to choose, Papa. You got one foot in forgiveness and one foot still stuck in the past. Can't stand like that forever without falling." Morrison's voice came from what seemed like an increasing distance. "The living world is calling you back, Bull. That boy who brought you here, Jamie, he needs an answer. And some choices can't wait for a man to feel ready." Bull spun around, suddenly remembering the child who'd appeared at his gate selling rope, the boy whose existence had started this impossible journey. The landscape behind him flickered between the drought-stricken badlands of his ranch and this verdant threshold place where the dead waited with infinite patience. "The boy," Bull whispered. "Who is he?" Young Rosa stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of maternal knowledge. "He's what happens when the living and the dead can't find peace. A bridge built from grief and unfinished business. But bridges work both directions, Bull. They can carry you forward, or they can bring you back to where you started." The cabin began to fade, its warm glow dimming like a dying fire. Bull could feel himself being pulled backward, away from Sarah and Mary and the forgiveness he'd never dared hope for. But with that pulling came a terrible understanding. This choice wasn't really about staying or going. It was about what kind of man he'd be when the moment of decision arrived in the living world. "If I go back," Bull said desperately, "will I remember this? Will I remember you?" Sarah's smile was already becoming translucent, but her love remained solid and real. "You'll remember enough. The question is what you'll do with the remembering." The 7-year-old Mary pressed something into Bull's palm, a length of rope braided in the perfect diamond pattern he'd taught her. "For when you need to remember that some knots hold stronger under pressure, Papa, and some things that look broken can be fixed if you're willing to learn new ways of tying them together." Morrison's voice came as if from across a vast canyon. "The boy's waiting, Bull, and he's been waiting a long time. Don't make him wait much longer. Bridges can only hold so much weight before they start to crumble." The world tilted sickeningly, colors bleeding together like watercolors in rain. Bull felt himself falling backward through time and space, through memory and regret, through 20 years of carefully constructed numbness. But clutched in his fist was the rope Mary had given him, its pattern perfect and familiar and impossibly real. He hit the ground hard, dust filling his mouth and nostrils. The scorching August sun beat down on his shoulders, and the familiar sounds of his drought-stricken ranch filled his ears. Bull pushed himself to his knees, disoriented and shaking, his mind struggling to reconcile what he'd experienced with the harsh reality surrounding him. The boy, Jamie, stood 10 feet away, watching with those two knowing eyes. In the harsh daylight, his resemblance to Mary was even more pronounced. But now Bull could see other faces layered beneath: Morrison's stubborn jaw, young Rosa's compassionate gaze, and something else that made his blood run cold. "You came back," Jamie said simply. "Most folks who cross over don't come back." Bull looked down at his clenched fist and slowly opened it. The rope was still there, its diamond braid catching the sunlight with impossible clarity, physical proof that whatever had happened wasn't just heat stroke or grief-induced hallucination. "What are you?" Bull asked, his voice hoarse with dust and fear and something that might have been hope. Jamie smiled, and for a moment Bull saw Mary's face shine through like sunlight through clouds. "I'm what happens when love refuses to let go, Mr. Thornton. And you got a choice to make." The ordeal was just beginning. Bull struggled to his feet, the rope clutched so tightly in his fist that the braided pattern pressed into his palm like a brand. The August heat that had seemed manageable before his journey now felt crushing, as if the weight of two worlds pressed down on his shoulders simultaneously. "What choice?" Bull asked, though part of him already knew the answer would shatter whatever fragile peace he'd found in that other place. Jamie's expression shifted, cycling through faces Bull now recognized. Mary at different ages, Morrison in his younger years, Rosa as she'd been decades before her daughter came to work at Bull's ranch. But underneath it all lurked something else, something that made Bull's newly unburdened heart clench with fresh terror. "The choice every soul makes when the accounting comes due," Jamie said, his young voice carrying ancient weariness. "Stay in the living world and face what's coming, or cross over permanent-like and leave the mess for others to clean up." What mess? But even as Bull asked, he could see it beginning. The drought-parched landscape around them started to shimmer and buckle, not with heat mirages, but with something far more sinister. The ground beneath his boots cracked in patterns that formed symbols Bull didn't recognize, but somehow understood meant ending, dissolution, the failure of all barriers between worlds. "You opened a door when you followed me today," Jamie explained, his form beginning to flicker like a candle in wind. "Doors between the living and the dead ain't meant to swing both ways for folks still breathing. Now it's stuck open, and things that should stay buried are starting to take notice." In the distance, Bull could hear his cattle lowing in distress. But underneath that familiar sound came something else. Voices calling his name, some pleading, some angry, some carrying the hollow echoes of those long dead. The voices of every person he'd wronged, every choice he'd failed to make, every moment of cowardice dressed up as practical thinking. "Close it," Bull said desperately. "Close the damn door." Jamie shook his head sadly. "Can't. Only you can close it, and only by choosing which side you belong on." "But here's the rub, Mr. Thornton. If you choose wrong, if you try to stay in both worlds, the door tears wider, and everything you've been running from for 20 years comes pouring through at once." The air around them began to thicken with more than heat and dust. Bull could see shapes moving at the edges of his vision, figures that shouldn't exist, memories given form and weight. He caught glimpses of Morrison's stolen cattle, their eyes black holes of accusation. Dr. Patterson's medicine wagon materialized and dissolved like smoke, leaving behind the echo of promises that had been lies from the beginning. Worst of all, he could see Sarah and Mary as they'd been in life. Not the peaceful, forgiven versions from the threshold place, but the Sarah who'd died disappointed in him. The Mary who'd suffered while he'd stolen and schemed and failed to save her anyway. "This isn't right," Bull whispered, backing away from the approaching phantoms. "They forgave me. Sarah and Mary, they forgave me." "The dead can forgive," Jamie said, his voice growing fainter as his form continued to flicker. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You spent 20 years building walls between yourself and the truth, Bull Thornton. Now those walls are crumbling all at once, and everything you kept out is rushing back in. Bull felt the rope in his hand growing cold, its solid reality beginning to fade just as Jamie's form wavered between substantial and translucent. The physical proof of his journey to that other place was dissolving, leaving him with nothing but memories that already felt like dreams. "How do I choose?" Bull asked, panic making his voice crack like a boy's. "How do I know which side I belong on?" Jamie's smile was infinitely sad as he began to fade entirely. "That's the one question I can't answer for you. But I can tell you this much. Time's running out, the door's getting wider, and pretty soon choosing won't be possible anymore. Then you'll belong to both worlds and neither, and that's a kind of existence that ain't living and ain't dying neither." The boy's form scattered like dust in the wind, leaving Bull alone beneath the merciless sun with phantoms pressing closer from every direction. He could hear Rosa, his Rosa, the living one, calling his name from the direction of the ranch house, her voice tight with worry. But he could also hear the young Rosa from that other place, speaking words of warning about bridges that crumble under too much weight. Bull looked down at his hand and saw only empty fingers, the rope gone as if it had never existed. The last physical proof of forgiveness and redemption had vanished, leaving him with nothing but the crushing certainty that he'd lost his only chance at peace. The voices of the dead grew louder, more insistent, and Bull realized with dawning horror that his ordeal wasn't ending. It was just beginning, and this time he might not survive it. The voices pressed closer, a cacophony of accusation and regret that made Bull's skull feel like it might crack open. He stumbled backward, his boots sliding in the dust, but there was nowhere to retreat to. The phantoms surrounded him on all sides, their forms shifting between memory and nightmare. That's when Bull saw him. Standing apart from the other specters, solid and real as carved granite, was a figure Bull hadn't seen in the threshold place. A man in a tattered cavalry uniform, his face bearing the weathered lines of someone who died old and bitter. The stranger's eyes held a familiarity that made Bull's blood turn to ice water. "You don't recognize me, do you, Samuel?" The man's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, even in death. "But then again, you were always better at forgetting inconvenient truths." Bull's mind raced, sifting through decades of buried memories. The uniform, the bearing, the way the man said his full name with particular contempt, pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. "Colonel Ezra Thornton," Bull whispered. "But you died in the war, died a hero at Antietam." His father's laugh was like breaking glass. "Died a hero? Is that what they told you? What I told you in my letters?" The phantom stepped closer, and Bull could smell gunpowder and decay. "I died screaming in a field hospital, boy. Died knowing that the glorious charge I led was nothing but a drunken mistake that got 63 good men killed for a hill that wasn't worth holding." The revelation hit Bull like a physical blow. His entire life had been built around living up to the memory of a war hero father, a man of honor and courage who'd made the ultimate sacrifice for his beliefs. Every failure, every moment of cowardice, every choice to take the safe path instead of the right one had been measured against that impossible standard. "You lied," Bull breathed. "All those letters home, all those stories about duty and honor, were the ravings of a broken man trying to convince himself his failures meant something." Colonel Thornton's form solidified further, becoming more real and terrible with each word. "Just like you've been doing for 20 years, building pretty stories around ugly truths, painting your cowardice as pragmatism, your selfishness as survival." The other phantoms began to fade as this larger truth consumed Bull's awareness. Morrison's cattle, Dr. Patterson's wagon, even the disappointed versions of Sarah and Mary. All of it dissolved like morning mist, leaving only father and son facing each other across a gulf of shared delusion. "You want to know what Jamie really is?" Colonel Thornton continued, circling Bull like a predator. "He's every choice you never made, every stand you never took, every moment you chose comfort over courage. He's the man you could have been if you hadn't spent your whole life running from your own shadow." Bull felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest, like the tectonic plates of his soul grinding against each other. The careful structure of self-justification he'd built over decades was collapsing, but instead of the crushing weight he expected, he felt something else entirely: relief. "You're right," Bull said, and the words came out steady and clear. "I've been a coward. Not just about the cattle I stole, not just about Mary's death, but about everything. Every day for 20 years, I've chosen the easy path and called it wisdom." His father's phantom sneered, admitting it doesn't change. "It changes everything." Bull straightened his shoulders, feeling strength flow into him from some unexpected source. "Because I finally understand what Jamie was trying to tell me. The choice isn't between the living world and the dead world. It's between being the man I've been and the man I could still become." The landscape around them began to stabilize, the sickening wavers and distortions smoothing out like wrinkles being pressed from fabric. Colonel Thornton's form started to lose its solidity, becoming translucent around the edges. "You think you can just decide to be different?" his father demanded, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "No," Bull said, and for the first time in decades he smiled with genuine peace. "But I can decide to stop lying about who I am. I can stop pretending that my father was perfect and that I failed to live up to him. We were both just broken men trying to make sense of an ugly world. The difference is, I still have time to do something about it." The phantom of Colonel Thornton opened his mouth to argue, but no sound emerged. Instead, his form began to crumble like old paper, taking with it the crushing weight of impossible expectations and inherited lies. Bull stood alone in the August heat, but for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't afraid of his own shadow. He finally understood what needed to be done, and why Jamie had come to show him the way. The real work was just beginning. Bull walked back toward the ranch house with steady steps, his boots finding sure purchase on ground that had seemed treacherous only moments before. The August sun still beat down mercilessly, but the heat no longer felt oppressive. It felt clean, honest, like the harsh truth he'd finally stopped running from. Rosa met him halfway across the yard, her face creased with worry lines that made Bull's chest tighten with something between guilt and gratitude. She'd been watching over him for years, seeing through his carefully maintained facade to the broken man underneath, and she'd never once abandoned her post. "Bull, what happened out there?" She searched his face, and he could see the exact moment she recognized something fundamental had changed. "You look different." "I feel different." Bull reached out and took her weathered hand in his, marveling at how solid and real she felt after his journey through phantom landscapes. "Rosa, I need to tell you some things. Things I should have said years ago." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the porch. "Let's get out of this heat first. Whatever you got to say, it'll keep better in the shade." As they settled onto the worn wooden steps, Bull felt the weight of 20 years pressing against his throat, but instead of the familiar choking sensation, this pressure felt different, like water behind a dam that was finally ready to be opened, controlled, and purposeful rather than destructive. "I stole Morrison's cattle," Bull said without preamble. 23 head, winter of 1932. "I was desperate. Thought I could sell them and get medicine for Mary, but by the time I worked up the courage to make the trip to Miles City, she was already gone." Rosa's expression didn't change, but her hand found his arm and rested there, steady and warm. "I figured as much. Morrison came around asking questions after you got prosperous so sudden-like. But you were grieving, and a grieving man sometimes does things his right mind wouldn't consider. There's more." The words came easier now, like a muscle remembering how to work properly. "I knew about Patterson's medicine being fake. Knew it before I bought it, but I told myself anything was worth trying. I wanted to believe in miracles more than I wanted to face the truth." Bull felt tears starting, but he didn't try to stop them. After 2 decades of drought, his heart was finally remembering how to reign. "Mary asked me that last night if she was going to die," he continued, his voice breaking. She looked right at me with those big eyes and asked if the medicine was going to work, and I lied to her, Rosa. I told her everything was going to be fine when I knew damn well it wasn't. Rosa's arms came around him then, strong despite her age, holding him while 20 years of unshed grief poured out of him like floodwater through a broken levee. She didn't offer empty words of comfort or try to minimize his failures. She just held on while he fell apart and trusted that he'd find a way to put himself back together. When the worst of it passed, Bull pulled back and wiped his eyes with hands that shook only slightly. "There's something else, something strange. That boy who came selling rope, I think he was some kind of messenger, or maybe a test. I don't rightly know what he was, but he showed me things, Rosa. Impossible things." "What kind of things?" Bull hesitated, then decided that if he was going to stop living in half-truths, he might as well start with the whole truth. "I saw Sarah and Mary, talked to them. They were at peace, forgave me for all of it, even though I never forgave myself." Rosa nodded, as if supernatural visitations were as common as summer thunderstorms. Sometimes the dead got business with the living, especially when the living are too stubborn to let them rest proper. "I think I've been keeping them tied to this place," Bull said, the realization settling over him like a heavy blanket. "All my guilt, all my refusal to forgive myself. It's been like chains holding them here when they should have been free to move on. So, what you aim to do about it?" Bull stood up, feeling purpose crystallize in his chest like steel cooling in a forge. "I'm going to make things right, all of it. Morrison's family, they deserve to know what happened to those cattle, and they deserve compensation with 20 years of interest. Patterson's victims too, if any of them are still alive. And I'm going to find out who that boy really was and why he came to me." Rosa smiled, and Bull realized he hadn't seen her truly smile in years. "Sounds like a considerable undertaking for a man your age." "Maybe so, but I've spent 20 years running from the past, and it's worn me down to nothing. Time to try running toward something instead." Bull looked out across his ranch, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time, not as an empire built on stolen prosperity, but as a tool that could be used for redemption. "I've got resources, Rosa. Land, cattle, money in the bank. Time I figured out what all that wealth is actually worth." For the first time since Mary died, Bull Thornton had work to do that mattered. The next morning, Bull rose before dawn with the kind of purpose he hadn't felt in 2 decades. His joints protested the early hour, but his mind was clearer than it had been since Mary's death. By the time Rosa arrived to start breakfast, she found him at the kitchen table surrounded by ledger books, bank statements, and a yellow legal pad covered in his careful handwriting. "Making lists already?" she asked, pouring coffee without being asked. "Morrison had 3 sons," Bull said without looking up. 2 of them are still ranching up near Glasgow, according to what I could remember. The 3rd moved to Oregon, but I figure the banker in town might know how to reach him. He tapped his pencil against the pad. 23 head of cattle in 1932, prime breeding stock, with interest in the calves they would have produced. He showed her the number he'd calculated. Rosa whistled low. "That's near half your liquid assets." "It's what's owed." Bull turned a page in his ledger. "Then there's Patterson's victims. That's going to be harder to track down. The man traveled through 5 counties peddling his snake oil, and most folks who got swindled probably aren't eager to advertise the fact." "You could put word out through the churches," Rosa suggested. "Pastor Williams has connections throughout the territory. Might be some of them families are still struggling with debts from medical bills that didn't need to happen." Bull nodded, adding another note to his list. The scope of what he was attempting felt overwhelming but not impossible. For the first time in years, he was thinking beyond the boundaries of his own ranch, beyond his own guilt and grief. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard interrupted his planning. Through the window, Bull saw a familiar figure dismounting near the gate. Sheriff Tom Bradley, his expression grim even from a distance. "Company," Rosa murmured. But Bull was already standing. He'd expected this conversation to come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time to prepare. Bradley knocked once and let himself in, the way he'd been doing for 15 years. But something in his bearing was different today, more formal, less like a friend stopping by for coffee. "Bull," Bradley said, settling his hat carefully on the table. "We need to talk about yesterday, about you chasing shadows out in the heat and coming back talking about dead children and stolen cattle." "Who'd you hear that from?" Bull asked, though he already knew. Word traveled fast in ranching country, especially word about a man losing his mind to grief and guilt. "Does it matter? Point is, I'm hearing things that concern me. Things about you maybe confessing to crimes that happened 20 years back." Bradley's eyes were sharp despite his casual tone. "Now, I've known you long enough to hope you're just having some kind of breakdown that'll pass with rest and time, but I've been sheriff long enough to know I can't ignore certain kinds of talk." Bull felt the moment crystallizing around him like winter frost. He could backtrack now, claim heat exhaustion and temporary confusion. Bradley would probably accept it, might even prefer it. The alternative was opening a legal mess that would complicate both their lives considerably. But Bull thought about Jamie's words, about choosing which side of the door he belonged on, about the consequences of trying to live in both worlds at once. "Tom," Bull said quietly, "what do you know about the Morrison family, the ones who lost those cattle back in '32? Bradley's expression hardened. "Bull, don't—" "The youngest son, Jimmy Morrison, he took his own life 2 winters after those cattle disappeared. Did you know that? Hung himself in his daddy's barn because the family was going to lose their land, and he blamed himself for not watching the herd closer." Bull's voice remained steady, matter of fact. "I didn't know it either until yesterday, but I should have known what my theft cost them beyond just the cattle." "Jesus, Bull." Bradley rubbed his forehead. "You can't just— There's procedures for this kind of thing. Statutes of limitations, legal complications that'll tie us both in knots." "Maybe so, but some things are more important than legal complications." Bull pulled out a sheet of paper from his stack, one he'd prepared before Bradley arrived. "That's my full confession about the Morrison cattle, signed and witnessed by Rosa. Dates, details, everything I can remember. What you do with it is up to you, but I won't be carrying it alone anymore." Bradley stared at the paper like it might bite him. "This is going to destroy you, you know that? Even if the legal stuff gets worked out, the reputation damage alone." "Good," Bull said, and meant it. "The reputation I've been protecting was built on lies anyway. Time it came down." For a long moment, the two men looked at each other across 20 years of friendship and carefully maintained silences. Then Bradley folded the confession and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "I'll need time to figure out how to handle this proper," he said finally. "Take all the time you need," Bull replied. "I'm not going anywhere." After Bradley's dust cloud disappeared down the dirt road, Bull stood in the doorway feeling the weight of inevitability settling over him like a familiar coat. The confession was out of his hands now, beyond his control, and that knowledge brought an unexpected calm. He'd spent 20 years trying to manage every outcome, control every consequence. This, letting the chips fall where they would, felt like breathing after a lifetime of holding his breath. Rosa appeared beside him, her presence steady as morning coffee. "You think he'll arrest you?" "Maybe. Probably not today, but eventually." Bull closed the door and returned to his papers, but his movements carried new urgency. "Which means I need to work faster. Can't make amends from a jail cell." "Or you could run," Rosa said quietly. "Take what cash you got, head for Mexico. Lot of American ranchers down there who don't ask too many questions about a man's past." Bull paused, his hand hovering over the ledger. The suggestion wasn't without merit. He had enough money to disappear, enough experience to start fresh. But even as he considered it, he felt Jamie's presence like a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. Not the phantom child he'd encountered yesterday, but something deeper, more essential. A reminder that running was what had gotten him into this mess in the first place. "No," Bull said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I'm done running. Whatever comes, I'll face it here." The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Bull was reviewing bank documents when he heard multiple vehicles approaching, not the single horse or truck that usually announced company, but the sound of several engines grinding through the heat. Through the window he watched 3 dust-covered automobiles pull up to his gate. The first man out was someone Bull didn't recognize, tall, lean, wearing a city suit despite the rural heat. Behind him came 2 others, an elderly woman in widow's black and a middle-aged man whose bearing suggested either law enforcement or military service. They moved with the purposeful coordination of people on official business. Rosa met them at the door, her weathered face carefully neutral. "Help you folks?" "We're looking for Samuel Thornton," the suited man said. "I'm attorney James Morrison, representing the Morrison family estate. I believe Mr. Thornton has been expecting us." Bull felt his heart skip, then settle into a harder rhythm. He hadn't contacted the Morrison family yet, hadn't even confirmed their current addresses. But somehow, impossibly, they'd found him first. "I'll get him," Rosa said, but Bull was already moving past her. "I'm Bull Thornton," he said, extending his hand to the lawyer, "though I'm curious how you knew to come here." James Morrison shook his hand with the grip of a man accustomed to difficult conversations. "We received an interesting telephone call this morning from Sheriff Bradley. He suggested we might want to speak with you before certain legal proceedings move forward." The woman in black stepped forward, her eyes sharp despite her age. "I'm Eleanor Morrison, Ezra Morrison's widow. This is my son Robert." She gestured to the military-bearing man. "We understand you have something to tell us about what happened to our cattle 20 years ago." Bull felt the moment crystallizing around him like Jamie had warned, the point where all his careful preparations and good intentions would be tested against the reality of facing the people he'd wronged. Eleanor Morrison's eyes held a lifetime of hardship, the kind of accumulated grief that came from losing a husband too young and a son to despair. Robert Morrison watched Bull with the calculating gaze of a man who'd seen combat and learned not to trust easy words. "Yes, ma'am, I do," Bull said, "but it's not going to be easy to hear. Might be better if we sat down for this." They gathered in his front room, the same space where he'd entertained neighbors and business associates for 2 decades. But now it felt different, smaller, more honest, like a courtroom where truth mattered more than comfort. 23 head of your cattle," Bull began without preamble. "I took them winter of 1932, sold them in Miles City to pay for medicine for my daughter, though she died before I could get back with it." Eleanor Morrison's intake of breath was sharp, but her voice remained steady. "Those cattle represented 3 years of careful breeding. They were our insurance against the drought." "I know that now," Bull said. "I knew it then too, if I'm being honest. But I told myself desperate times called for desperate measures, told myself I'd find a way to make it right later. Later never came, though, did it?" Robert Morrison's voice carried the edge of controlled anger. "Not when my family lost the ranch. Not when my brother killed himself because he thought he'd failed to protect our stock." The words hit Bull like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of consequences he'd spent 20 years avoiding. This was his final test, not facing phantoms or wrestling with his own guilt, but sitting across from the real people his choices had destroyed and accepting their judgment without excuse or deflection. "No," Bull said quietly. "Later never came. Until now." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, heavy with 2 decades of unspoken grief. Bull could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the same one Sarah had wound faithfully every morning until the day she died. Robert Morrison's hands were clenched into fists, and Bull recognized the restraint it was taking for the man not to reach across the space between them. "You want to hit me," Bull said, his voice steady. "I can see it in your face. 20 years ago, I would have wanted the same thing." "Hitting you won't bring Jimmy back," Robert said through gritted teeth. "Won't undo the shame he carried thinking he'd failed us. Won't give my father back the will to live after we lost everything." Eleanor Morrison placed a restraining hand on her son's arm, but her eyes never left Bull's face. "What I want to know," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who'd buried too many men, "is why now? Why confess after all these years? What's changed?" Bull looked out the window toward the empty yard where Jamie had first appeared, selling his impossible rope. How could he explain the visitation, the confrontation with his own guilt made manifest, the realization that his refusal to face the truth had been keeping the dead tethered to his failures? "I've been haunted," Bull said finally. "Not by ghosts, by my own cowardice. I built this ranch on stolen prosperity and told myself I deserved it because I'd suffered, but suffering doesn't give a man the right to cause more suffering." "Pretty words," Robert said, his voice sharp as winter wind. "But words don't rebuild a family, don't resurrect the dead." Bull reached for the papers on the side table, his prepared calculations and bank statements. But Robert Morrison was faster, standing with the fluid motion of a man who'd learned violence in foreign wars. He crossed the room in 2 steps, his face inches from Bull's. "You think you can pay us off?" Robert's voice was barely controlled fury. "Write a check and make it all disappear? My brother died believing he was a failure. My father drank himself into the grave before his 50th birthday. What's your money worth against that?" "Nothing," Bull said, not backing down despite the younger man's proximity. "My money isn't worth a damn thing against what I cost you, but it's all I have to offer, and I'm offering all of it." Robert grabbed Bull by the shirt front, lifting him slightly. For a moment, Bull thought the man might actually strike him, and he found himself almost hoping for it. Physical pain would be simpler than this reckoning, cleaner than facing the arithmetic of destroyed lives. Robert Eleanor Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let him go, Mother. Let him go." Her tone brooked no argument. "Violence is what men do when they run out of better ideas. We came here for answers, not vengeance." Robert released Bull's shirt but didn't step back. The 2 men stood eye to eye, breathing hard, 20 years of anger and guilt crackling between them like electricity before a storm. "You want the truth," Bull said, his voice rougher now. "I've been dying by inches ever since I took those cattle. Every success, every dollar I made, every neighbor who called me a good man, it all felt like swallowing poison. I should have come forward years ago, but I was a coward, still am maybe, but I'm a coward who's finally run out of places to hide." "Guilt isn't suffering," Robert shot back. "Guilt is what you feel when you still have choices. We lost our choices the day you decided your daughter's life was worth more than our family's future." The accusation hit Bull like a physical blow, but underneath the pain was something else. Relief. Here, finally, was someone willing to speak the unvarnished truth about what he'd done. No soft words about desperate times or understandable mistakes. Just the brutal mathematics of his selfishness. "You're right," Bull said. "I chose my grief over your family's survival. I chose my desperation over your security, and when I had the chance to make it right, I chose my reputation over your justice. I've been choosing myself over others for 20 years. And now," Eleanor Morrison's voice was quieter, but it carried more weight than her son's anger. "What are you choosing now, Mr. Thornton?" Bull looked at the 3 faces arrayed before him, lawyer, widow, grieving son, and felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble away. This was the confrontation he'd been avoiding since 1932, the reckoning that all his wealth and success couldn't prevent or postpone any longer. "I'm choosing to stop running," he said, "from the law, from the consequences, from whatever justice you think I deserve. I'm done protecting myself." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Eleanor Morrison studied Bull's face with the calculating gaze of a woman who'd learned to measure men's souls by their actions, not their promises. "Stop running," she repeated slowly. "That's what you say now. But words are wind, Mr. Thornton. What does stopping look like when it costs you everything?" Bull felt the question settle into his bones like winter cold. This was the moment Jamie had been preparing him for. Not just confession, but true sacrifice, the difference between saying he'd give up everything and actually doing it. "It looks like this," Bull said, moving to his desk with deliberate calm. He pulled out a thick folder of documents, each page representing hours of calculation, legal preparation, and soul-searching. "Deed to the ranch. All 37,000 acres, plus water rights and mineral claims. James Morrison, the lawyer, leaned forward despite himself. "Mr. Thornton, you can't simply—" "I can, and I am." Bull's voice carried the finality of a man who'd wrestled with angels and lost everything that mattered. "The ranch is worth roughly 4 times what I stole from you, accounting for improvements and land values. But your cattle would have bred, would have sustained your family through the Depression years. This is what I calculate that security was worth." Robert Morrison's face had gone pale. "You're talking about millions of dollars. I'm talking about a debt that's been eating me alive for 20 years. Bull set the deed on the table between them like a poker player showing his cards. "The ranch goes to the Morrison family estate. Full ownership, clear title, no conditions." "Bull!" Rosa appeared in the doorway, her face stricken. She'd been listening, understanding what his decision meant for her, for the hands who worked the land, for the community that depended on his operation. "It's done, Rosa." Bull's voice was gentle but unyielding. "I should have done this years ago. Should have done it before Jimmy Morrison decided his life wasn't worth living." Eleanor Morrison reached for the deed with trembling fingers, then pulled her hand back as if the paper might burn her. "This is madness. Land this size, this valuable. It's not proportional to what you took." "Isn't it?" Bull met her eyes directly. "Your youngest son is dead because he blamed himself for my theft. Your husband drank himself to death because he couldn't provide for his family after I stole your security. How do you calculate the worth of destroyed lives, Mrs. Morrison? How do you measure the cost of a father's broken spirit or a young man's despair?" The room fell silent, except for the relentless tick of Sarah's clock. Robert Morrison sank into his chair, his anger replaced by something closer to shock. The lawyer shuffled through papers with the mechanical precision of a man trying to process the impossible. "There's more," Bull continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was surrendering. "The bank accounts, investment portfolio, everything liquid goes toward tracking down Patterson's other victims. Rosa's got the full list we've compiled. Families across 5 counties who lost money to medical fraud after Patterson fled." "Mr. Thornton," James Morrison said carefully, "what you're proposing would leave you essentially destitute. At your age, starting over—" "I'm not starting over," Bull interrupted. "I'm ending what should have ended 20 years ago. I've been living on borrowed time and stolen prosperity. Time to pay what's owed." Rosa stepped fully into the room, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "And what about the people who depend on you? The ranch hands with families? The businesses in town that rely on your operation? You're not just sacrificing yourself, Bull, you're sacrificing all of us." The observation hit Bull like a physical blow. In his focus on personal redemption, he'd forgotten the web of lives connected to his decision. 12 full-time hands, their wives and children, the feed store, the bank, the dozens of small businesses that depended on his ranch's continued operation. "That's the cost," Bull said quietly, and for the first time since beginning this confession, his voice cracked slightly. "That's what I've finally learned. There's no redemption without sacrifice, and sacrifice always costs more than just the person making it." Eleanor Morrison stood slowly, moving to the window that looked out over the vast expanse of Bull's, her, land. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pastures where cattle grazed, oblivious to the legal transfer occurring in the ranch house. "You think giving us everything you've built will bring them back?" she asked without turning around. "You think bankrupting yourself will resurrect my son?" "No, ma'am," Bull said. "But maybe it'll finally let them rest. Maybe it'll let me stop pretending I deserved something I built on their graves." Eleanor turned from the window, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. "Then God help us all, Mr. Thornton, because once this is done, there's no taking it back." Bull looked at the deed lying between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of guilt and grief. "I know," he said. "That's the point." Bull reached for his pen with fingers that barely trembled. 20 years of accumulated guilt had crystallized into this single moment, the transfer of everything he'd built on another family's suffering. The deed lay before him like a judgment, waiting for his signature to make the sacrifice real. Wait! Eleanor Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade through canvas. Just wait a moment. Bull's hand froze above the document. The widow had moved back from the window, her weathered face showing the kind of struggle that came from wrestling with decisions too large for any one person to bear alone. Mother? Robert Morrison's voice carried confusion and something that might have been hope. The man's offering us everything, more than we ever lost. I know what he's offering. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on Bull, studying him with an intensity that made him feel transparent. But I'm not sure I know why. Not really. And I've learned not to trust gestures that seem too grand to be real. James Morrison, the lawyer, cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Morrison, I understand your hesitation, but this is an extraordinary offer of restitution. The legal value alone... The legal value is meaningless if it's coming from guilt instead of justice. Eleanor interrupted. Mr. Thornton, you say this will let the dead rest. But whose rest are you really buying, theirs or yours? The question hit Bull with the force of truth he wasn't entirely prepared to face. He set down the pen and leaned back in his chair, feeling suddenly older than his 58 years. Maybe both, he said finally. I won't lie and say this isn't about my own guilt, but I've seen what my theft cost your family. I've carried the weight of Jimmy's death every day since Rosa told me what happened. If giving up everything I stole can prevent that kind of tragedy for someone else, then yes, it's worth bankrupting myself. Robert Morrison stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace, where photographs of Bull's family watched from the mantel. You talk about Jimmy like you knew him, like his death was personal to you. But you never met my brother, never looked him in the eye or shook his hand. He was just collateral damage to you. No, Bull said, his voice roughening with emotion. He wasn't collateral damage. He was the cost of my cowardice, and I've been paying interest on that debt every day since. Pretty words again. Robert's reflection wavered in the glass covering Sarah's photograph. But you're still here, still breathing, still able to choose redemption or damnation. Jimmy doesn't get those choices anymore. Rosa moved quietly to Bull's side, her presence both protective and reproachful. Robert's right about one thing, she said. Your guilt doesn't resurrect the dead, but maybe your honesty can prevent more dying. She pulled a folded telegram from her apron pocket, her movements careful and deliberate. This came an hour ago. Sheriff Bradley found 3 more families who lost money to Patterson after he fled here. One of them, the Hendricks family up in Wolf Point, they lost their savings to him last month. Mrs. Hendricks is pregnant, and they've got no money for a doctor when her time comes. The telegram passed between them like evidence in a trial, each person reading the stark facts of fresh victimization. Bull felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this time it carried purpose instead of just guilt. Patterson's still out there, Bull said quietly. Still using the reputation I helped him build to destroy families, the money from liquidating my assets. It could track him down, help his victims, maybe prevent the kind of despair that killed your son. Eleanor Morrison took the telegram from her son's hands, reading it twice before speaking. You're asking us to become partners in your redemption, to take ownership of your guilt along with your property. I'm asking you to help me do something useful with 20 years of accumulated shame. Bull met her gaze directly. The ranch will be yours regardless, but what we do with the rest, the liquid assets, the investigation into Patterson, that could be something we decide together. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of decisions that would echo through multiple lives. Outside, the late afternoon shadows grew longer, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed as the hands brought them in for evening feeding. Mr. Morrison, Eleanor said finally, turning to the lawyer, what would be required to establish a fund for Patterson's victims, something legal, accountable, with proper oversight? James Morrison adjusted his spectacles, his mind already working through the legal complexities. A charitable trust could be established fairly quickly. We'd need trustees, clear guidelines for distribution, regular AU. Dits. But yes, it's entirely feasible. He glanced between Bull and the Morrison family, though I'd recommend keeping Mr. Thornton involved as an advisor, given his knowledge of Patterson's methods and victims. Bull felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of purpose beyond mere restitution. "You'd trust me to help manage the fund? After everything?" "Trust?" Robert Morrison laughed, but the sound carried less bitterness than before. "I don't trust you, Thornton, but I trust your guilt. A man carrying 20 years of shame doesn't make the same mistakes twice." Eleanor Morrison moved to the desk, her fingers hovering over the deed. "If we do this, if we take the ranch and establish this fund, what becomes of you?" Bull looked around the room that had been his sanctuary and his prison for 2 decades. Sarah's photographs watched from the mantel, and he could almost feel Jamie's presence in the shadows, waiting to see if the lesson had truly been learned. "I go back to what I was before I stole your cattle," Bull said. "A ranch hand with nothing but his labor to sell. Rosa's already offered me work as a foreman on the place, assuming the new owners want to keep me. The irony being that you'd be working land that should have been ours all along," Robert observed. "The irony being that I'd finally be earning what I take instead of stealing it." Eleanor picked up the pen Bull had set aside. "Then, let's make this official. But we're doing it right. Legal trusts, proper oversight, regular accounting, no more secret guilt or private shame. Everything transparent." Bull watched as she signed her name below his on the deed transfer. The stroke of her pen felt like the closing of a door he'd been holding open for 20 years, a door that led back to the man he'd been before grief and desperation had twisted him into someone he barely recognized. Rosa squeezed his shoulder gently. "You'll stay in the foreman's cabin. It's smaller than this house, but it's honest work, honest wages." "Smaller's fine," Bull said, surprised by how little the prospect of reduced circumstances bothered him. "I've been rattling around this big house like a ghost anyway." James Morrison gathered the signed papers with professional efficiency. "I'll file these tomorrow and begin the trust paperwork immediately. The Hendricks family should have assistance within the week." As the lawyer prepared to leave, Robert Morrison approached Bull with measured steps. The younger man extended his hand, not in friendship, but in acknowledgement of a debt finally paid. "I still think you're a bastard," Robert said as they shook hands, "but you're an honest bastard now. That's something, I suppose." Bull accepted the grudging truce with a nod. "It's more than I deserved." After the Morrisons and their lawyer departed, Bull and Rosa stood alone in the gathering dusk. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if the weight of accumulated secrets had finally lifted from its beams and foundations. "Any regrets?" Rosa asked, beginning to collect the scattered papers and documents. Bull considered the question seriously, looking out the window toward the pastures that were no longer his. In the distance, he could see the hands bringing in the evening gather, their voices carrying across the cooling air. Tomorrow they'd work for different owners, but the cattle still needed tending, the land still required care. "None," he said finally, and realized he meant it. "For the first time in 20 years, I feel like I can breathe all the way down to my boots." Rosa smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "Jamie would be proud, I think, not of what you had to do, but of what you finally chose to do." At the mention of the mysterious boy who'd started this reckoning, Bull felt a strange sense of completion. Whether Jamie had been ghost or vision, or simply the manifestation of his own long-suppressed conscience, the child had accomplished what 20 years of prosperity couldn't. He'd taught Bull the difference between surviving and living. "Come on," Rosa said, heading toward the kitchen. "Let's fix some supper. Tomorrow you start over, but tonight you're still the man who finally came home to himself." Bull followed her from the parlor, leaving behind the empty deed folder and the silence of a debt finally paid. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance he could swear he heard the sound of a child's laughter fading like echo into the vast Montana night. The ranch would continue under new ownership. The victims would receive their due, and Samuel Bull Thornton would wake tomorrow as simply Bull, A man with calloused hands, a clear conscience, and finally, after 2 decades of running, a place to call home. The new beginning. 3 months later, Bull woke before dawn in the foreman's cabin, as he had every morning since the transfer. The small space, 2 rooms and a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, felt more like home than the big house ever had. Through the single window, he could see the main ranch house where Eleanor Morrison now lived, smoke already rising from the chimney as she prepared breakfast for her son and the visiting lawyer who'd become a regular fixture in their efforts to track down Patterson's victims. Bull pulled on his work clothes, the same worn denim and flannel he'd owned for years, and stepped outside into the crisp October air. The morning routine had become ritual: check the horses, review the day's work with the hands, and ride fence on land that belonged to someone else but felt more honestly his than it ever had when his name was on the deed. "Morning, Bull." Tom Garrett, one of the younger hands, approached with the day's assignments written on a scrap of paper. "Mrs. Morrison wants the north pasture cattle moved down before the weather turns. Says there's a storm coming in tomorrow." Bull nodded, accepting the paper, though he barely glanced at it. Eleanor had proven herself a capable ranch owner, making decisions with the kind of practical wisdom that came from growing up on the land. She consulted him on major choices but never made him feel like a charity case or a man living on borrowed authority. "Tell Mrs. Morrison we'll have them moved by afternoon," Bull said, checking the cinch on his saddle. "And Tom? Take Rodriguez and Martinez with you to check the water tanks. This freeze is going to hit harder than the weather service is calling for." As the hands dispersed to their morning tasks, Bull rode out toward the northern boundary where the fence line met the horizon. The work was the same as it had always been. Cattle still needed moving, fences still required mending, and the land still demanded constant attention. But something fundamental had changed in the way he approached each task. Where once he'd worked with the driving urgency of a man trying to outrun his conscience, now he labored with the steady rhythm of someone who'd finally found his place. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost and revealing the golden sweep of grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. Bull paused at the crest of a hill he'd ridden countless times before, but today his attention was caught by something new: a small figure walking along the fence line below, carrying what appeared to be a bag of tools. For a moment, Bull's heart seized with the impossible hope that Jamie had returned. But as the figure drew closer, he could see it was simply one of the Mexican hand's sons, a boy of perhaps 12, who sometimes helped with small repairs around the ranch. The child looked up and waved, calling out a cheerful "Buenos dias, Señor Bull," before continuing on his way. Bull waved back, smiling at his own momentary fancy. Jamie, whatever Jamie had been, belonged to a different time, a different version of himself. The boy's purpose had been fulfilled the moment Bull signed away everything he'd built on stolen foundations. There was peace in that knowledge, a sense of completion that felt as solid as the horse beneath him. By midday, the cattle had been successfully moved to lower ground, and Bull was riding back toward the ranch buildings when he saw a familiar truck pulling up the main drive. Sheriff Bradley climbed out, followed by a woman Bull didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a small bundle. Eleanor Morrison emerged from the house to greet them, and Bull could hear fragments of conversation carried on the wind. Words like "found him" and "arrested in Denver" and "restitution" painted a picture that made Bull spur his horse forward. "Bull," Eleanor called as he approached, "Sheriff Bradley has news about Patterson." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Caught him trying to run another medical swindle down in Colorado. Had nearly $10,000 on him, money we can trace to at least 6 different victims." He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is Mrs. Hendricks from Wolf Point. She wanted to thank you personally." The pregnant woman Bull had heard about in Rose's telegram stepped forward, her bundle resolving into a sleeping infant wrapped in hand-knitted blankets. "My baby was born healthy because of the fund you established," she said simply. "The doctor said without proper care." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Bull dismounted, suddenly awkward in the face of gratitude he still didn't feel he deserved. Mrs. Hendricks, I'm glad the fund could help, but you don't need to thank me. If anything, I owe you an apology for allowing Patterson to operate as long as he did. Maybe so, she said, adjusting the baby's blanket against the cool breeze. But what matters is what you did when you finally understood the cost. That takes a different kind of courage than most men possess. As Sheriff Bradley's truck disappeared down the dusty road an hour later, Bull found himself standing alone with Eleanor in the fading afternoon light. The ranch house cast long shadows across the yard, and in the distance he could hear Rosa calling the hands in for supper. "Do you miss it?" Eleanor asked quietly, gesturing toward the house that had once been his domain. "The authority, the ownership, the feeling that all of this belonged to you?" Bull considered the question, watching as lights began to appear in the windows of the bunkhouse and the small cabin that was now his home. "I thought I would," he said finally. "But ownership and belonging aren't the same thing, are they? I owned this place for 20 years and never belonged to it. Now I belong to it in a way that has nothing to do with deeds or titles." Eleanor nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. "Jamie would be proud," she said, echoing Rosa's words from months earlier. "Not of what you lost, but of what you found." At the mention of the boy who'd started his journey toward redemption, Bull felt that familiar sense of completion. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, he could almost hear the echo of a child's laughter, but it no longer carried the weight of accusation or guilt. Instead, it sounded like approval, like a job finally finished and a lesson fully learned. Bull walked toward his cabin as the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, his footsteps steady on ground that belonged to someone else, but felt like home in ways that ownership never could. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, and the continuation of a life built on honest labor rather than stolen prosperity. He was no longer Samuel Bull Thornton, empire builder and cattle baron. He was simply Bull, a man with calloused hands, a clear conscience, and finally, after 2 decades of running from himself, a place where he truly belonged.